Welcome to a deep dive into this kind of surprising trend that's reshaping a lot of young adults' lives. We're going to be looking at the rise of young caregivers.
Hmm.
And for this, we're going to be drawing on some research from Forbes, BenefitsPRO, and the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health.
Hmm.
So just imagine you're in your late teens, early 20s, just starting to kind of figure out your life, and all of a sudden you find yourself responsible for a loved one. And this is the reality for more and more young people these days.
Right.
And today we're going to take a deep dive into what that means for them and really all of us.
Yeah, it's a topic with a lot of different angles to it. We hear a lot about the challenges of aging populations,
Sure.
but
Yeah,
we don't always connect that to what it means for younger generations.
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that really jumped out at me in the Forbes study was this statistic that 60% of new caregivers during the pandemic were
What?
Gen Z or millennials. So that's not just like a small increase. That's more than half
Yeah.
of all new caregivers.
It really shows how the pandemic, I think, kind of accelerated a trend that was already there. Like COVID-19 forced a lot of young adults to move back home,
Right.
and that put them in these caregiving roles that they maybe weren't expecting.
Makes you wonder about the long-term consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone kind of expects some level of family caregiving, right?
Yeah.
Where's the line between like fulfilling a family obligation and this
Yeah.
becoming a burden on young adults?
Yeah, that's a really important question to be asking.
Yeah.
And it's something I think as a society we need to talk about more because there's a real risk that this trend is going to make existing inequalities even worse. We already know that women and people of color are more likely to be caregivers.
Right.
And so if you have younger people from those groups who are even more likely to be taking on these roles,
Right.
it could really limit their opportunities.
For sure. And then what about the impact on mental health?
Oh, absolutely.
That same Forbes study found that 72% of Gen Z caregivers in the U.S. said their mental health got worse during the pandemic. That's huge.
Big number.
It is. And it really makes it clear that, we need more support systems for these young people. To give you a real-life example of this, the Forbes article tells the story of Alex Hernandez, a 26-year-old freelance journalist living in Dallas.
Mm.
And when her mom was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, Alex had to make this really tough decision to move back to Mexico to take care of her.
Yeah.
So her story really highlights how a family illness can just completely change a young person's life. She had to put her career on hold, break her lease, and basically put her whole life on pause.
Yeah. It's more than just statistics, right? It's about real people who are going through these things.
Absolutely. And it's not a temporary thing either. The Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, they've been studying this trend for years.
Right.
And their research is showing that it's been building for a while. So this isn't just a pandemic thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long-term shift that's happening.
That's right. People are living longer, which means they're living with chronic illnesses for longer. And a lot of times that requires more intense care. And if you think about that, combined with, how families are changing these days, more single-parent households, blended families, people living further away from their families.
Right.
It all adds up to kind of a perfect storm for a caregiving crisis.
Yeah. And young adults are right in
Yeah.
the middle of it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest consequences is probably the financial strain, right? The Forbes study said that more than half of young caregivers globally are afraid that, being a caregiver is going to hurt their future careers. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
They're trying to juggle work and school and caregiving all at the same time.
Absolutely.
And that's in an economy that's already pretty tough.
Yeah, and especially when you think about, entry-level jobs, those don't usually come with generous leave policies or flexible hours.
Right.
So that makes it even harder to balance everything. I mean, we're talking about a generation that's already dealing with student loan debt, rising housing costs,
Right.
and a job market that's really competitive. So when you add caregiving on top of that, it's no wonder they're feeling stressed.
For sure. And BenefitsPRO actually published a study that found that family caregiving is putting a lot of strain on people's retirement plans.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just young people, it's like a domino effect.
Yeah, it affects multiple generations.
It does. And it's not just careers that are taking a hit. What about education?
Yeah, that's a big one too. The Johns Hopkins study, they found that 1.6 million young people between 15 and 18 and another 2 million between 19 and 22 are providing essential care to adults in the U.S. So that's millions.
Wow, that is a huge number.
Yeah, it really puts the scope of the problem in perspective.
Hey, guys.
And it's not just helping out with chores. We're talking about essential care, like managing medications, helping with daily tasks, providing emotional support. All of that takes time and energy away from school.
It's basically like a second job. except they're not getting paid for it.
Right. And the study found that these young caregivers spend 42 fewer minutes per day on schoolwork and 31 fewer minutes actually in class
Wow,
compared to their peers. So that's a big difference.
it
And it
is.
can really affect how well they do in school and their future opportunities.
So it sounds like this could be a real crisis in the making.
It's definitely a concern, and we need to be talking about it and figuring out how we can support these young people. We can't just expect them to handle all of this on their own.
Yeah, for sure. We need to do better.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, we'll look at the big picture. Like, what does all of this mean for society as a whole? Okay, so we've been talking about all the challenges that young caregivers are facing, the money problems, the impact on their education, the emotional stress. But now I want to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture here. What does this trend mean for everyone, for society as a whole?
That's a really important question, and one that I don't think gets enough attention. We've talked about the impact on individual people, but if we zoom out a little bit, we have to think about what happens when you have a whole generation that's dealing with more and more caregiving.
Yeah, it seems like there could be some pretty serious consequences. I mean, we talked a little about the financial impact, but could this lead to a shortage of skilled workers?
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, if you have young people who are waiting longer to start their careers, or they have to work less hours or take jobs that pay less because of their caregiving responsibilities, that could have a big impact on all sorts of industries.
So we could be looking at this talent drain right at the same time that the need for skilled workers is going up.
Exactly. And it's not just the workforce. There are these wider social implications too. If young people are spending more time caregiving, they have less time for other things that are important for a strong society, like being involved in their communities or even just building relationships and starting their own families.
Right, it's like this domino effect that impacts not only these young people, but like the whole fabric of our communities.
Exactly. And we can't forget about things like innovation and new businesses. If young people are so busy with caregiving, are they going to have the time and the energy to come up with new ideas and start new companies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It makes you wonder if this could actually slow down economic growth over time.
It's definitely something to think about. And then there's the issue of taking care of older people in general. As the population gets older, the demand for care is only going to go up. So who's going to provide that care if younger generations are already stretched so thin?
So we've talked about needing policy changes, but what are some actual solutions that could really make a difference here?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to create a culture where people feel okay talking about their caregiving responsibilities and asking for help. A lot of times there's this stigma around caregiving, like you should be able to handle it all by yourself.
Especially for young people, right? They're supposed to be independent and self-sufficient.
Exactly. And that can make it even harder to reach out for support. So we need to change that story and make it clear that it's actually a sign of strength to ask for help, not weakness.
Okay, so more open conversations, more understanding, less judgment.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have to actually back that up with real support. Things like affordable respite care, flexible work schedules, and financial help can make a huge difference in the lives of these caregivers.
And those policies need to be inclusive, right? They need to recognize that different caregivers have different needs.
You're totally right. We can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach here. Some caregivers might need help with getting around, others might need mental health services, and others might need help navigating the whole complicated world of elder care.
So it sounds like we need this multi-pronged approach that deals with all of it. The practical stuff, the emotional stuff, and the money problems too.
Exactly. And we have to remember the people who are receiving the care too. They need to have good quality care options that work for them and what they prefer.
Yeah, that's right. This isn't just about supporting the caregivers. It's about making sure the whole system works for everyone involved.
Exactly. And this is going to take all of us working together. Policymakers, employers, families, and communities all need to be part of creating a system that's more supportive and fair.
You know, as we're talking about this, I keep thinking about that statistic from the Forbes article. You know, despite all the challenges, 91% of millennial caregivers said that caregiving was rewarding.
Yeah.
So 91% found it rewarding.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing, right? I mean, it really shows that even when things are really tough, there can be these moments of real meaning and connection.
Absolutely. Caregiving can be so hard, but it can also be incredibly rewarding. It can bring families closer, teach people valuable skills, and even help people find a deeper sense of purpose.
It's like Alex Hernandez said, "It sounds weird, but my mother's death made me want to live."
That's such a powerful statement. And it really shows how much potential for growth there is in caregiving. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the challenges. Focusing on the good parts shouldn't mean we forget about the real burdens that these young people are carrying.
Yeah, we have to support them, fight for what they need, and work towards a system that values and empowers both the people giving care and the people receiving it.
I agree. And it all starts with recognizing that this isn't just a personal problem, it's a societal problem that we all need to pay attention to and do something about.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. And before we go, I want to ask our listeners,
Mm.
what are you thinking about all of this? What surprised you? What really resonated with you?
And as you keep thinking about all of this, I encourage you to consider how these trends might be affecting your own life or the lives of people you know.
Maybe you have a friend or family member who's a young caregiver. Or maybe you're starting to think about your own long-term care needs. No matter what your situation is, we hope this conversation has given you some things to think about.
And we're not done yet. We'll be right back to explore some potential solutions and think about what a more supportive and equitable system of caregiving could actually look like.
We've talked about a lot in this deep dive. We've looked at personal stories, statistics, and kind of the big picture of what this whole trend of young caregivers means for society. But now I want to get into what we can actually do about it. Like,
Yeah.
what can we do as individuals and as a society to better support these young people who are stepping up and taking care of their loved ones?
It's a big question, and I think the very first step is just recognizing that the problem exists. A lot of young caregivers are kind of hidden in plain sight. They might not even think of themselves as caregivers, or they might not feel comfortable asking for help.
Right, it's like they're carrying this burden that
Yeah.
nobody can see.
Yeah.
So how do we bring this issue out into the open?
We need to start talking about it more, openly and honestly. And these conversations can happen anywhere: families, schools, workplaces, even just with our friends. The more we make caregiving, especially for young people, a normal thing to talk about, the less alone they'll feel.
So it's about breaking down those stigmas, making it okay for young people to say, hey, this is hard, I need some help.
Exactly. And it's not just about talking, it's about actually doing something. We need to advocate for policies that provide real, tangible support for young caregivers.
Like, what kind of policies are we talking about here?
Well, one thing that would make a big difference is affordable respite care. Imagine if every young caregiver could get a few hours of reliable, affordable care for their loved one each week. That would give them a chance to breathe, to focus on school or work, or even just take care of their own mental health.
That makes a lot of sense. What else?
Flexible work arrangements are really important too. Employers can do a lot to support young caregivers by offering things like working from home, flexible hours, maybe even on-site childcare.
Right, it's about recognizing that they're trying to do it all: work, school, caregiving, and giving them the flexibility they need to make it work.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the financial side of things. Caregiving can be incredibly expensive, especially if you're also dealing with things like medical bills, transportation, and lost wages. So we need to look at things like tax credits, subsidies, and even direct financial assistance to help lighten the load.
So it sounds like we need to approach this from all angles, dealing with the practical stuff, the emotional stuff, and the financial burden too.
You got it. And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We need a system that's flexible and responsive to the different needs of each caregiver.
So it's not just about creating these resources, it's about making sure they're accessible and that they actually meet the needs of each individual.
Right. Some caregivers might need help with transportation, others might need counseling or support groups, and others might need help understanding the whole complicated world of elder care.
And we need to give young caregivers the power to advocate for themselves too, right?
Absolutely. We need to give them the tools and information they need to navigate the system, to communicate what they need effectively, and to make informed decisions about their caregiving journey.
It's about changing the story from one of burden and sacrifice to one of empowerment and agency.
Exactly. And recognizing that while caregiving is challenging, it can also be a source of meaning, connection, and growth.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance, recognizing the hard parts, while also celebrating the strength and resilience of these young people.
Well said. Ultimately, it's about creating a society that values and supports both the people who give care and the people who receive it.
We've dug into a lot of tough issues in this deep dive, but I think the main message is clear. We can't afford to ignore this trend. The well-being of young caregivers and the future of caregiving itself depends on what we do.
We need to keep having these conversations. We need to push for changes in policy, and we need to build a culture that supports and empowers those who are caring for their loved ones.
This is where the real deep dive begins. It's not just about understanding the issue, but about actually doing something about it. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new topic.